Okay there, Jean?
What? I'm trying to get this stupid light. I don't know. Trying to get it out of the mirror.
Good afternoon.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Is that Laura? Laura back?
Charlie, yes, I'm back.
Good to see you.
You too.
Shucks.
Thanks, Chris.
I couldn't see anybody. Hi, Chris. Hi, Anand. Charlie.
Hello.
Mayor, how are you today?
Good. Good. I just saw Elizabeth, but I cut her off. Sorry, Liz.
I do want to let everyone know that depending on how long this goes, I do have another engagement at 6 o'clock that I might have to leave early this meeting for, just to give you a heads up. But hope I can get through most of this.
Yeah, that's fine, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, I was just testing my mic and
It's
headphones.
working.
It's working.
Is everybody from the Smart Growth team here?
Yes, we are. We're all here. This is Marta Goldsmith, and we are.
That's Jean. Okay, I think we're going to begin. And I just wanted to make a few really brief announcements. First of all, the meeting will last until 6:30. And initially, there'll be a presentation, and it will be Chris Belden, who is presenting for Church Community. At that point, he can introduce his team from the Northern Equitable Development Strategy Group. And then also introduce Smart Growth America. At the point of questioning, first we'll have the members question any parts of the presentation. Secondly, members of the planning board. Third, the health equity zone, and then the general public. All questions will be directed to the Smart Growth members in their presentation. So without further ado, Chris, would you like to begin?
Sure. Just have to unmute my phone to get my microphone here to get started. So thank you to Mayor Napolitano, members of the City Council, the members of the Planning Board, city staff, and the rest of my fellow Newport residents for attending. It is my honor and privilege to have this role of introducing you all to the Smart Growth America team that's been hired to create an equitable development plan for the north end of Newport. And I'll introduce a couple of folks from the HEZ, the Newport Health Equity Zone, after me, and they'll give you the background of the HEZ, which is actually the organization that has the contract with Smart Growth America. But my job basically is to provide some quick background and context so that everybody's all on the same page. What I'm going to talk about is the history that has led us here, and then try to answer two questions, which are why and why now. So why do we need an equitable development plan, and why is this happening now and not sooner? So first, for the background, I think it starts with the Carpianato Group's proposal to redevelop the Highlight property. And along with that, they submitted their own zoning regulation proposal. The city then issued a moratorium. Instead of just accepting Carpianato's zoning proposal, it decided that it would be better to do a master plan to have a more inclusive and comprehensive plan for the vision of the north end of Newport. And so it did an RFP and hired NBBJ, and NBBJ produced the North End Urban Plan, which has been approved by the Planning Board and is under consideration by the City Council for final approval. And that vision for the North End that is described in the North End Urban Plan will then inform the proposed zoning and other development regulations, which would implement that vision for the North End. So that's the background that brings us up to where we're at. And so the question of why we need an equitable development plan, I think gets to the idea that things have happened over time and there are unintentional consequences. And it seems that those unintentional consequences generally tend to injure the most vulnerable members of our community. Examples of that include the highway spur to nowhere, which created a physical barrier that, unintentionally separated, both socially and economically, the North End from the rest of the city, and also the concentration of affordable housing in the North End. It was something that was done because there are a lot of different factors that led to it: the availability of land, the price of the land, and just the thought that there was a huge unmet need for affordable housing, and so when there's an opportunity to produce it, let's produce as much of it as possible. But now we know, that actually it's better to produce integrated affordable housing, that instead of concentrating it all in one particular part of the city or one neighborhood, that the opportunities for children that grow up in integrated affordable housing are better, and the outcomes are better than if you concentrate it all in one area. So there have been, and these are just two examples of actions that have happened that have had the unintentional consequence of putting the low and moderate income and minority residents at a disadvantage. And so what we have before us now is this North End urban plan. And, when you look at the plan and you think about other redevelopment efforts that have preceded it, for example, the Broadway redevelopment, and when you think about it in terms of scale, so, there was public investment and we made improvements to the streetscape, to the sidewalks and, curbing, and created some cafe areas, some street trees and pavers and that kind of thing, and some landscaping. And then you look at the gentrification impacts on the West Broadway neighborhood, which had historically been an African-American neighborhood. And when you think about that in the context of what's being proposed in the North End urban plan, about what that level of investments could do to the North End urban plan and what kind to the North End neighborhood, and what kind of effects that would have on the residents that live there now. And I think this is something that we can all relate to. I think anybody, I was born in Newport. I've lived here now for the last at least 15 years. And, I think anybody that's lived here for any significant amount of time has a list of friends and family who used to live here that don't live here anymore because they moved somewhere that was more affordable. And so, that's fine. Like, I had friends that lived right next door in an apartment, and they got to the point where they were looking to buy. They chose to move to North Kingstown. And that's not a bad place. But when you talk about the North End residents, it's not the same kind of comparison, because you have folks that are just barely making ends meet. Folks who, with one bad life experience could end up homeless. And you have now a community that represents a support network for the residents there. And so it isn't the same as saying, like, well, if you can't afford to live here, that's fine. Just go wherever you can afford to live, because these are folks that don't have the same opportunities and advantages that many of us do have. And so, and not to mention that they love Newport. I've had many conversations and asked them, like, would you prefer to move somewhere else? And the answer is no. And inevitably, if they can't afford to stay in Newport, if we make decisions that ultimately force them to go elsewhere, it's probably not going to be the same as my neighbors who just decided to move to North Kingstown. It's probably going to be to the next place where that's experienced historic disinvestment, until that municipality, that city or town, decides that they want to redevelop that area and they get moved to the next place. So I think that's really, the question at hand. And I'd just like to share my screen for a second and show you, I think, let's see. I don't know if you can see that. I was going to show you, I don't know, it's not coming up as an option right now. Let's see if that'll do it. Can you see this image of the North End?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. So, this is the North End that we all know, and another picture of it. And then when you look at the images in the North End urban plan, you can see the scale of what's being proposed, the difference between what exists and what's being proposed. And so I think it's really easy then to understand, how the investment involved in this has the potential to cause more people in our community to not be able to afford to stay in Newport. And, this isn't just, homeowners who can barely afford to pay their property taxes now. But it also, the increased property values that will result from this kind of investment also create an incentive for affordable housing owners to convert their housing to a market rate to take advantage of the increased property values that this will cause. And I know that people say, well, there's a lot of public housing and that's well protected, but it's not all public housing. Festival Field is privately owned, I think, this is what we have the option right now. We can make a choice to continue doing business as usual, to make decisions that unintentionally injure the most vulnerable members of our community, or we can choose to take action to encourage investment, but to put in effect strategies and policies that will counteract the unwanted effects of this investment, the displacement that it is very likely to cause, and to, instead of having new development just worsen the lives of those residents, but to figure out ways to make new development not just benefit the city in terms of increased tax revenue, and not just benefit the developers in terms of increased development potential, but also to actually benefit the residents in the North End. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jasmine and Nat from the HES.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I have a question. I'm listening to you, and it seemed as though you were saying that the city created the concentration of low-income housing, but the city really didn't in the North End.
No,
I mean,
that's
that
not what I
was in
was
the
saying.
1940s from the Navy,
Yeah.
when the Navy land was put aside. So it's not as though the city made a conscious effort to do this.
Right.
And so I
Kate,
think you
can I
kind of
just-
brushed over that.
Yeah, Kate, can I just, I'm sorry, can I just interject for a moment? Why don't we save our questions for after the presentation, because council members will go first, okay? And then we can go right down the line, because there are probably others that have the same question that you did.
But mine wasn't a question. Mine was a statement.
Okay, well, save your statement for
Mm.
when we get to the council. Thank you. Okay, Chris, can you proceed, please?
Sure. I mean, I'll just say that I completely agree. I wasn't saying that the city did it intentionally. As I mentioned before, there were numerous factors that resulted in that concentration. My point was just that things happen, and then you learn as a result of it. And we now know that this kind of master plan initiative that allows for higher intensity development has a definite potential to exacerbate gentrification and the displacement that comes with that. And I want to say, gentrification, I'm an advocate for gentrification. I think gentrification basically just means making a place nicer, but I want gentrification without displacement. I want that gentrification to not just benefit, the haves, but I want the gentrification to benefit the people that have been here in our community for generations as well. So I'll just turn it over to Jasmine and Nat from the HES to provide you with some background on who the HES is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. So hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here tonight. My name is Jasmine Ray. I work with the Women's Resource Center, which is the backbone agency for the Newport Health Equity Zone. I am one of the strategy managers of the HES. I am here tonight to kind of provide you with a little overview of the HES project. Mainly, so the Newport Health Equity Zone is a citywide coalition mobilizing residents and resources of the Broadway and North End neighborhoods to make Newport a place where everyone can thrive. We envision a city where structural, financial, and environmental barriers to health and well-being are eliminated. Public policy fosters the good health of residents, and residents feel empowered to control the health of their families and community. We were established in 2015 as one of 10 place-based zones that was funded by the Rhode Island Department of Health. And so over the past 6 years, the Newport has organized residents and community partners to address environmental factors contributing to poor health in the HES. In every aspect of our project, we utilize a racial equity lens and resident-driven approach to develop it and implementing social determinants health-focused strategies for improving community health through structural change. The HES Collaborative understands that the strength of our Northern community depends on equitable access to resources and opportunities for leadership. We believe that individuals thrive when they are not solely recipients of change, but hold agency in their communities' decision-making and determinations. Our collaborative currently right now has 8 focus areas, and housing is one of them. So I wanted to just share that, and I would like to have Nat come in and just kind of share her story and speak to how she's been engaging in this work and what how being a resident of the community invested in making changes really affects her life and people within her community. So I believe she's not on the panelist, but if someone in the back can welcome her in.
We see her. We see
Okay.
her. She's here.
Good. All right. Thank you, Angela.
Hi, everybody. And I'd just like to thank everyone for your time and listening to my story and how the has changed and affected my life. Thanks, Jazz, for that intro. My name is Natalie Harris, and I've been a North End resident the majority of my life. I started with the HES when I was invited to join the Peer Health Advocacy class. And after receiving my certificate as a peer health advocate, I continued and I was hired part-time by the Women's Resource Center, which is the backbone agency of the HES, to continue my community work as a community health worker fellow. That is a training program in order to eventually receive my certificate through the state and become a certified community health worker. I'm also involved in many working groups alongside many partners such as Church Community Housing with the Housing Working Group and Equitable Community Table with the Food Access Working Group and many others in order to be a bridge and build relationships between partners in my community in order to make a better place for my children and grandchildren to live and thrive without bias. Working with the HES, I have been given a voice around the table with leaders and decision makers of this city and state. Also, I learned a great deal about racial equity, and my next steps in my career with the HES is to become a strategy specialist and continue to build many more relationships with partners and remain a voice of my community, city and statewide. The HES is a gem in the North End community and a great place in order for residents to learn how to build many skills in order to be a voice for their community. And I would just like to say that I love HES. I love working with HES and my experience with HES. I become a better person and a better person for my community. Thank you.
I think we're next. I think Smart Growth America is next on the agenda. So Mayor, if that's all right, we'll just proceed. As I said, my name is Marta Goldsmith, and I'm the project manager on behalf of SGA. We have a brief presentation today to begin to tell you who we are and how we work in this area and how we will be working with the residents of the North End. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen and introduce our CEO and President, Calvin Gladney. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
And Calvin, I'll turn it over to you now. Just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Ms. Mayor, city councilors, city staff, our clients, the North End community, particularly the HES, WRC, and Christian Belden. Thank you for having us. And everyone who took the time out this evening to both hear our presentation, but to have this discussion. As Marta said, we're not going to have a long presentation because we want this to be a discussion. So we're just going to kind of quickly introduce ourselves, talk a little bit about what we know, and then probably open things up for questions. There's a number of us here. Marta? So we brought out, we just wanted to show you the kind of breadth and depth of both our team, but also the type of experience we're bringing to bear, working on behalf of the North End community and working with all of you. So again, as Marta said, my name is Calvin Gladney. I'm President and CEO of Smart Growth America. I have Chris Zimmerman with me, Beth Osborne with me, and Marta, as you met already. And so we'll be your presenters today. And we're just illustrative of a larger team of, we actually have a company of 27 people. But today we just wanted to bring you some of our senior leadership and the type of expertise and experience we're going to bring to bear to make this equitable development strategy work and work for the community. Next. Just a brief introduction to Smart Growth America. This is what we call our North Star. It's sort of our why, if you're a Simon Sinek fan. It's the reason why we exist. And if you read it, it says, we envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And the reason why we wanted to share that North Star, the sort of our reason for being with you as an introduction to us, is that you can read that statement and see that having an outcome that's equitable, having equitable development, living up to the things that Christian talked about earlier, as well as Jasmine, is in our DNA. It's what we're about, it's why we exist. And we leverage those blue boxes that you see below, our advocacy work, our technical assistance, of which this is, and our thought leadership to actually get to those outcomes. So we just wanted to share that, you know, this is not different from our normal work. It's kind of what we do. These are just a number of examples of various projects and the types of work we do, both legislatively and otherwise. We don't need to get up into a lot of detail, but we're almost a 20-year organization. But again, you'll meet a number of us today that can show that not only do we bring experience being a consultant and providing technical assistance, but it's important to mention our advocacy work, because what we're doing here, because a lot of the context, as Christian talked about, really does really does deal with legislative policy and policy making. We're not lobbyists in this regard, but what we are going to be is helping the community think about what are the appropriate tools, strategies, and options to get to equitable outcomes. And as Christian said, help revitalize the community without displacement, or gentrification without displacement. Next. Just wanted to give you the context as we know it. This project, or our work, was funded by the Van Buren Charitable Foundation. Project sponsor is the HES. Coordination is really working with the WRC and Christian's group, the Church Community Housing Group. But our client ultimately are the residents in the community, the North End community. So we just wanted to set that as the context. So when we think about our work and as we talk with you today, we know that the city council, mayor, city staff, and the general public are part of the context, and the people we know we need to be trusted brokers, honest brokers, and honest sort of providers of recommendations or thoughts. But we're ultimately working with and for the North End community with the project coordination team. And so that's the context in which we sort of come before you today. Next. You know, Christian talked a little bit about this, and so these are just all the various details. But what I wanted to really mention is that and Christian actually talked about why we're here today, but from our standpoint, we're coming in to say this is a moment of evolution, that this is a moment of the next step in a process that's already begun with a lot of moving parts. And I'll tell you, we work all around the country, and we go to places where nothing has happened, where there isn't a comp plan already in place. There isn't an urban plan in place. There aren't zoning amendments that happen. There isn't a viable set of community organizations that have thoughts about equity, are preparing, proposals to amend the zoning. There isn't guidelines for a character-based code already in play. There isn't a development program that's being proposed by a developer like Carpianato is doing on the Grand Casino site. We go places all the time where they are starting from the very beginning. So you guys are in a really good place, not only because you have a market that has possibilities, but you're also already working on these issues. And so we feel like this is a great moment to take everything that you've done, build upon it, fit ourselves into what's already happening, and out from that process, end up with an equitable development strategy that really helps the residents and community of North End feel good about what happens next. Finally, next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about equitable development. And actually, Marta, I'll ask you to go back one slide, because I wanted to make just a couple of general points that I think we wanted to share with you, not only specific details, not specific details, but really our most important point here was to share with you how we thought about this moment. So part of it, how we think about this moment, it's a moment of evolution. It's the next step in an existing set of processes and things that are already happening. But the other thing we wanted to say is when you think about equitable development, you can get into what that means. We have a slide that really gets into a little bit details next, and that'll be the final slide, and then I'll pass it on. I also wanted to say that one way to think about all of this, everything that we're going to be working on and working with the community about and working with everybody, city council, city staff, the mayor, and the general public and the like, there'll be a working group of the community, I believe, is to think about how to make sure that we not only benefit the place when it comes to development, but we benefit the people. So it's a people plus place sort of strategy. So that's one. The second is, and Christian got into this a little bit, is the idea of making sure that the development that happens and the changes that happen. And one of the changes isn't just development. The realignment of the Pell Bridge and that planning and study effort is also part of this puzzle. And Beth Osborne will give you a sense later about our abilities and our knowledge about transportation and these infrastructure changes and things to think about. But one of the ways we think about all of this is to make sure that whatever strategy in place thinks about both offense, how do we get what we actually want in terms of the development, but also defense. And that is, partially what Christian talked about, which is how do we make sure that the market does move and there is revitalization, but we play some defense and we try to defend against displacement of existing residents and the like. And then finally, making sure, I always like to say equitable development and remind folks that equitable is the adjective and development is the noun. So what we also want to do is think of a public-private collaborative way of making sure that the strategy we put in place and the work that we do, make sure that there's input from the community and it puts the people first and thinks about how to make sure they benefit. But we also ultimately want to get to development. And so we're going to bring everything that we know and everything we can bring to bear to make sure that not only do we think about equity, but we think about how to get to equitable development. And we want both of those. Last slide, Marta. And this is just, a little bit of detail that dives down into what we mean by equitable development. I gave you a couple of narrative senses of the term, but it talks about development at the neighborhood scale. So rather than just saying, hey, there's a particular project on the Grand Casino site, or hey, there's this zoning that's going to affect different particular projects, let's think about what this would mean for the neighborhood. How do we put in place a strategy that says there are a number of moving pieces, but let's make sure we don't lose sight, as folks always say, let's not lose sight of the forest for the trees, and let's think about the neighborhood level. I talked about anticipating and mitigating displacement, both the risk of current residents being displaced as well as businesses. a meaningful place at the table. So equitable development is not just about the development itself, it's about the process to get there. And what can we do as part of the strategy and as part of the process of doing this project to think about how to make sure residents get input and are able to give their thoughts and their recommendations about the decisions that will affect them, and giving them a place at the table. And then finally, thinking about the development and saying the value of the development isn't just that you get new buildings, but what are the other ways that these developments and the market movement can actually benefit the residents as they stay? So not only the value of making sure that residents can stick around, but also how else can they derive benefit from what happens next? So that's a sort of overview of our general thinking of equitable development, a sense of our thoughts of the project, a little bit of an introduction to ourselves. And now I'll hand it over to a couple of other members of the team to talk a little more detail about things that we understand and things that we know. Beth?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. I'm really just going to talk about some of the work we've done and how it aligns with what you are already planning to do. I think what you're doing on the transportation front is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to watching it play out, because I know a lot of other communities are very seriously considering redesigning or removing highways, and they're thirsty for examples, because unfortunately it's not something that many communities have done, particularly in the last 20 years. So let's go on to the next slide. I just wanted to give you a little history of my involvement in this issue. I grew up in New Orleans, and there is a project that divides a neighborhood called Treme, which is just next to the French Quarter. Got some fame about 10 years ago with an HBO series, but it's a beautiful historic neighborhood that was absolutely ravaged by a highway put down one of their main roads, known as Claiborne Avenue. This is what Claiborne Avenue looked like before. This was not only the heart of Black society in New Orleans, but this was a really beautiful tree-lined street that, if you go to the next slide, you'll see what my city did. And as you might imagine, yeah, I see Natalie's expression. Yes, that is the appropriate reaction. It was devastating to the neighborhood. Even though it's above ground, it swamps the buildings on the side. And if you walk underneath it, which I've done several times, it is a very intimidating environment to be in. So then, as opposed to other highways that literally and physically disconnect the street grid, this creates such an intimidating atmosphere that you just don't want to walk from one side of the Treme neighborhood to the other. When I was at the U.S. Department of Transportation, I ran a program that at the time was called Tiger and now is called the Build Program. And we gave money to look at taking this project that a lot of locals call the monster down. And if you go to the next slide, you can see what they wanted to study in the city, to bring it back to the ground, to turn it into a greenway that it once was, and to connect the downtown area to other business districts just through a boulevard. One of the things we ran into, or there are two big problems we ran into in the study, which taught me a lot about the things to look out for when taking on these projects. And I share it just to let you know that this is something we regularly see on these projects, and to let you know it's something that we have some capacity to help with. One is the models that transportation departments use to look at how to design a purpose highway. Are really old, and they are really inaccurate. And so they can't detect trips that might go away. No trip could ever end. No trip could ever stop. You wouldn't ever shift a trip to an online order according to our models. You would never shift corridors. You would never try a different mode. So it can show traffic data that pushes the transportation agency to go so big on the new roadway that you lose a lot of the benefits of the repurposing of the highway. The other thing was the fear of displacement. As you might imagine, a hulking project like that destroyed generational wealth for the community. but they've had this monster in place to hold down property values. If you remove the thing holding down property values, you are no longer holding down property values, and they come up. And the people who live there are fearful at a time where there's a lot of hunger for communities like this, and we have made a practice of stopping building them, that they could be displaced by the increase in cost. So if you go on to the next slide, I just wanted to share with you something that we've been working with folks on Capitol Hill. And there is a current proposal underway to create a competitive grant program to redesign or construct outdated highways and arterials that would specifically take an aggressive position in favor of preventing displacement, which is something that I've started talking with a handful of cities for most public investments, because a good public investment does create price pressures, and we should not hope to avoid that, but aggressively take it on and make sure that the people in the neighborhood are able to see the upside of that investment. So the federal government is looking at funding that would establish land trusts for big projects to do just that, to preserve affordability and help people in the area pay to purchase any land that they live on so that they can experience the monetary upside. And the second thing is to update the models so that we don't end up with replacing a highway with such a broad boulevard or arterial that it just maintains the same sense of a wall between the two sides. And this is something we spend a lot of time in helping communities with, is figuring out how to translate some of those fearful model results and design techniques into something that truly connects, creates cohesion, walkability, and supports all kinds of movement, including driving, transit, biking, walking, etc. So that's just a little bit about us and how we might be able to support your really excellent project going forward. And at this point, I'm turning over to Chris.
Thanks, Beth. So I'm Chris Zimmerman, and I lead the economic development team at Smart Growth America. And I just want to sort of briefly give you an idea of kind of what we do, our approach to economic development, and kind of a little bit also where I'm coming from. So I'm an economist by profession, and so I, look at things that way, and whatever biases that go with the profession that I'm from, obviously, are there. But I also spent a large part of my adult life doing the job that you are doing, in that I spent 18 years as an elected official, in which, kind of in real world situations, I had to deal with these very same kind of issues. And in my community, we had these very same kind of issues with equitable development being, the fundamental challenge. How do we grow because we want to build our tax base, we want more opportunity, and how do we do that in a way that doesn't displace the community that's here? So I'm familiar with those challenges on the ground in that sense, and through the last 7.5 years at Smart Growth America, having the chance to see these challenges around the country in different places. Slide. So, we do this a number of different ways. We do some of our own research. We look at things like what's happening. This is an example here of a study we did a few years back, when we noticed that companies were moving into town after decades of moving out of town, and the consequences of that, and looking at the reasons for it. And we look at a variety of different kind of things. What happens when you insert a new transit line? What do opportunity zones mean for a local economy, and so on. Slide. Some of our work is very specific in place-based work that we do, for instance, with folks that have transit stations or new transit lines coming in. This is an example of some work we're doing right now in California, where we're looking at, what is this changed condition, essentially, by bringing in a new transit line. What's that going to do to the community? How do you leverage that? How do you capture what's the value that's there for the benefit of the community, and how do you make sure that it does benefit everybody? Next slide. And this is just to give a kind of quick overview of the kinds of places we've been, just to show the variety. There's the full list wouldn't fit on a slide, but these are all within relatively recently. Just to make the point that we've worked in big places and small places, as Calvin said. We work in places that have nothing going on, and we have places where the big concern is everything's happening. It's happening so fast. What's going to happen? So we have had the benefit of kind of seeing these different situations and learning from them. And what we've learned is, ultimately these have to be local decisions. The knowledge is really in the community, and you need to understand the local context because what's needed is going to vary very much from place to place. Next slide. This is, again, just an example of work we did, in this case in Richmond, Virginia, where we use a variety of tools. And that's the thing, was we try to do data-driven analysis using a variety of tools that can help to understand and inform the policy process, from the engagement all the way through to devising a plan. Next slide, please. And this is an example that is, particularly relevant to the kind of issues we're talking about today, because if your goal is to have revitalization without displacement, I think that was, consistent with what Christian said at the outset. Part of what you need to be able to do is to understand exactly, what the risk is, and that in part means being able to quantify it. You need to anticipate, what the good thing you're doing is going to allow values to raise, as Beth said, and that has potential negative consequences. But in order to deal with that, we need to figure out kind of what are the likelihoods there. So, for instance, you have market rate housing. You need to know how much of that market rate affordable housing is going to be subject to displacement, that is, to rents rising or redevelopment or whatever it is, so that you can then calibrate a policy response. And that's this particular example happens to be from Portland, Oregon, but we've done this kind of work in various places around the country. Next slide. And then lastly, this is just to mention something that I worked on for a lot of years when in my community, when I was an elected official, because we had a major project to try to improve a corridor, which happens to be the part of the county I live in, that definitely was sort of in the neglected part of my community for a lot of years, and people really wanted to see things happen and improve and get a better quality of life. But at the same time, there was this concern about, if it becomes more valuable, what happens to the people? It's a very diverse community, people from, who speak 100 different languages in their homes, and, incomes all the way, from very low income to fairly affluent people. How do we make sure we don't displace those? And we basically set a goal that we want to do this and displace nobody. So, how can we develop a plan that incorporates that? And we spent quite some time doing that. And it left me with the feeling, first of all, that it's a really big challenge, but also that it's doable. We're going to create value. And if we think about it ahead of time and we leverage that value to benefit everybody, we can have a plan that means that our community can be just as diverse when we're done. It's just a better place to live, and all of us can enjoy it. And that's really the goal for community-based economic development at Smart Growth America. And with that, I'll turn it over to Marta.
Thank you, Chris. So up until now, we've told you a little bit about who we are and what we believe and how we do our work to fulfill our mission. I am going to focus on, at a very high level, what we will be doing in the North End with the city and with the North End residents over the next several months. We're offering this at a very high level because this is an iterative process, and we learn as we go, and we bring the ideas and the resources that we've developed across the country. But each place, while it has similar challenges as other places do, it also is unique. So this will be, as I said, an iterative process, but this is sort of how we're starting out. So our work will be done in 2 phases. And so the first phase will be through the summer of this year. And we will start in phase 1 by engaging community leadership and stakeholders. And we do that by creating a local advisory group of residents and others in the North End community. And they will include community leaders, local decision makers, people from community-based organizations, anchor institutions, and others. In addition to that, we're doing a wide cross-section of stakeholder interviews. We'll be reaching out to many of you to identify, to set up interviews, because we want the perspective not only of residents in the North End, but also other people who interact with the community, who have dreams about the community, and who have invested in the community or would like to invest in the community. For example, we started our stakeholder interviews today. Our first interview was with Erin Donovan Boyle, who is, as you know, I'm sure, the executive director of the Greater Newport Chamber of Commerce. And we had a very good discussion from a business perspective about the North End. So we will be casting our net very broadly, and we look forward to talking to many of you. We also will be doing what we call an equitable development audit. We like to say, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we will be tracking, developing a measure equitable development through demographics and investment and change over time, as well as engagement in processes and that kind of thing, so that we will know where we start, where we want to get to, and what our progress is to getting there. So we're in the midst of that now. Chris's team in particular, which does a lot of our analytics, is working on collecting and analyzing a lot of that information, as well as background reports and data. And then we also will be holding community workshops. We'll be engaging many people across the community in identifying what their priorities for the community are, their challenges, their needs and opportunities from a very focused development and investment perspective. And we will be developing our equitable development strategy based on that input. And in addition to that, we will be identifying equitable development tools. You have many of them actually in your community right now, and we're learning about those. You have some new zoning amendments, you have a new urban plan, you have, I understand, a land trust, and there are housing and job training programs. We're going to be looking at those and assessing those with the residents to see how those are working and how they might be leveraged to accomplish the goals that the North End strategy, the North End residents have set for themselves. We'll also be looking at new strategies. Community benefits agreements are one tool that many communities use, as well as a new strategy called a tax stabilization strategy to ensure that as property values go up, that it's a tool to manage displacement. We'll be looking at that, as well as the opportunity to create a place management organization that would represent the community. So we'll be looking at all of these tools and many others that we're familiar with. And then we'll be engaging with you, city decision makers. This is not only an iterative process, but a collaborative process. We know that you've already done a lot of work in this area, and this equitable development strategy, as Calvin said, is a next step in that process. And then in phase 2, which will be starting in the fall, we will be holding more workshops and continuing to engage with the city officials and staff. We also will define what the priority measurable outcomes are and put those tools together in a toolbox, which we call an equitable development strategy. And then we will help the community launch that strategy, whether it's creating a place-based organization, revising zoning, building some new tools, or perhaps educating themselves better on the tools that already exist. And most recently, we've done a very similar project in the Union Square neighborhood in Somerville, which, as you probably know, is a city adjacent to Boston and Massachusetts. So we're using some of that experience to bring to this setting as well. And so that's pretty much where we are. Mayor, I'll turn it back over to you, if I may, so that we can have questions from the counselors and the planning board and others who might want to engage with us. So if that's okay, I'll stop sharing my screen so we can talk face to face. Mayor, I think you're muted.
Are there any council members that currently have questions for the group? Yes, Councilor Holder.
Yeah, first of all, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is it's a pretty impressive lineup of people. So Just a quick question. You're hired by HES, correct?
Actually, Counselor, our contract is with the Women's Resource Center, who is the coordinator for the HES, and the funding, as Calvin said, came from the Van Buren Charitable Foundation.
Gotcha. Now, do you normally, with your other projects that you guys have mentioned, are you normally hired by a community organization, or do you ever work with the cities or towns directly as well?
Yes, it varies a lot. Counselor Holder, sometimes we are hired by the city. We've done work for the state, for states. We also have gotten grants from foundations or contracts with the federal government to work with a variety of cities or states. So we have a pretty diverse funding set of funding sources. For example, we just wrapped up a project on housing affordability in Northwest Arkansas, which was a contract with the Walton Family Foundation, and we worked with the cities there and the regional organization. So we really have a diverse portfolio in that regard.
All right, great. Thank you so much.
Hey, Counselor Segley and then Counselor Bova.
Hello.
Counselor Segley.
Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate all of this information that you've given us. I'm curious because, we've been through, quite a bit of public input with the North End Urban Plan, certainly with the comprehensive land use plan. And I'm just curious as to what you see is missing from our North End Urban Plan that would foster this equitable development. Can you give me a little bit of an idea about what it is that, like, how do you drill down into what we already have?
Thank you for that question, and I'm gonna refer to Calvin to start that response, and then I think Chris has some thoughts about that as well.
One thing I will say is I probably wouldn't necessarily use the term "what's missing," because sort of as I said in the very beginning, you guys have done a lot of work. And I always use the term that it takes a village to achieve equitable development. And just the fact that you can be in a room, virtual room, where the city council, the mayor, city staff, residents, various nonprofits are all thinking about these issues means that, to me, there's a lot already here. So I would say part of it is we feel like there are just places that we can fit in and drill down rather than we're trying to create something that doesn't exist at all. Even as Marta said earlier, we're going to consider some strategies, but a lot of those you guys are already discussing. So community benefit agreements, a place management organization that would say, hey, who is the one that's going to make sure that the community can continue to benefit, has input, can think about these issues? Those are not ideas that we came up with from scratch. Those are ones that are already circulating. So I think a lot of it is taking different ideas that have come to pass, getting more input. So maybe there are different residents, different stakeholders have new ideas, marrying what we hear with what we have from our experience in terms of things that we think work or don't work, or have seen work or not work in different places. And then saying, let's custom fit a recommendation based on the input, based on what we know, and based on the ideas that are already circulating to try to get to a series of outcomes. So I think hopefully that answers your question, but yeah.
I'm just curious about, what strategies have you implemented in other communities that have, successfully prevented displacement? I mean, how do we do that? I mean, would your plan give us a roadmap on that sort of, on that goal? I'm wondering.
I think
Should I try?
Oh, go ahead. Yep.
Well, I was going to say first, and let me say to, as to underscore what Calvin said, we don't come in assuming that something's missing, or if that is, that we know what that is. So we're just at the front end of this. So, our first goal is to listen and learn. Secondly, again, along the lines of what Calvin was saying, these are processes that go on and on. Whatever you've done, there's going to be more to do. There's, if I learned anything from my experience with it is you're never done. And so, if you do a good job in the first parts of it, you still learn there's all kinds of things you need to do in implementation and things you need to add in. And you'll discover those to some degree as you go. In, the various places that, that we've worked, different tools have worked in different places, and they don't, the same thing doesn't work, one size doesn't fit all. And even if it's the same kind of tool, it has to be crafted in a way that meets the particular needs. So, in our case, in the example that I cited from, here in my community, what we did, we found it wasn't going to be one thing. We found that in order to take on this issue and, ensure that the future development was equitable, that we were able to create enough units at, different price points and the different kinds of housing we needed, that we were going to need a very large toolbox. So we put together a whole range of things. So we used little pieces. So, you can use, if you, can find a way to use TIF, for instance. We'd never used TIF before, but we came up with a way to use TIF. We do have a place-based, place management organization, so we could take advantage of some things there. We put in a number of different kinds of zoning ordinances. We created some new tools. We did transfer of development rights. We basically came up with a whole array. We looked at, like 50 different things, and a whole bunch of them we couldn't do because under the laws of our state, that wasn't possible or they weren't practical. And, we narrowed it down, and then we basically got the biggest set of them we could do and modified them in ways that would work for us, and then tried to calibrate them so that they would provide what we needed. And so that's it. I mean, it is always going to be bespoke. It's going to depend on the particular circumstances, the needs of your community, and what you can do under the laws of your state.
Beth, anything to add? So, and the last thing I would say, Councilor Underwood, is that we really focus more on a people strategy and the people tools, and rather than in addition to the land use and development tools. And so we will bring some tools for consideration that you haven't yet had the opportunity to think about, because you've been, you did a comp plan and then a small area plan, your urban plan, and now zoning amendments, and those all focus on sort of regulating the land use. And then layered on top of that, or along with that, will be, how do you support the local businesses? How do you ensure that housing displacement is minimized? The other thing I'll say is that, I work a lot on form-based zoning codes, which the character-based zone is a kind of a form-based code. And when I first started working on form-based codes 5 years ago, I was told, well, form-based codes cause displacement and gentrification. And what I learned, partially because Chris Zimmerman educated me to this, is that in fact, form-based codes don't cause displacement or gentrification. They create more attractive and appealing places. And because those places are scarce, the value goes up. But if there's an intentional set of policies and programs that a city puts into place in support of a community, as those improvements in the form of the community are made, then displacement doesn't have to occur, because as our mission statement says, everybody should live in a place that's healthy and prosperous and resilient. But you have to be intentional about that if you're going to create better places, because we're not yet in a country where every place is equally appealing. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
I think so. Thank you. I just also want to just mention that our North End urban plan has been incorporated into our comprehensive land use plan. So that's something that we already voted to do that. So, this would be something that would be in addition to that. Thank you.
Yes.
Councilor Boga?
Implementation strategy rather than a plan. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to SGA for this presentation. I mean, Hez and Christian and everyone. This was super informative and helpful, and I really appreciate it. The question that I have is, as you talk about this equitable development strategy and the implementation of that strategy, a question in my mind is what the level of engagement from SGA will be like over time to help with the actual implementation. I recognize that you are that HES and the Women's Resource Center, and those are who contracted you, but a lot of what you presented was, to me, really was great and stuff that I want to see happen and us be able to implement. And it's the same goals that we have in the North End Urban Plan and in a lot of the same goals we have in the comp plan, things that we want to make happen. But I feel like we've seen, not just in Newport, but in everywhere where you have these great plans and the implementation is where the struggle occurs. And I think, by us having a meeting like this and everyone in the community being really aware of that issue shows that we don't want that to happen. We want that implementation to successfully occur. But I want to know what that participation by SGA would look like and how we can make that successful.
Yeah, Calvin, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. I'll say two things. One is, one of the reasons why we started the conversation in terms of our intro to SGA and mentioned that we do a lot of advocacy is that, and I'll say it this way, you can give a woman a fish, you could teach her how to fish, or you could teach her how to build a fish market. And so because we are advocates and not just consultants doing technical assistance projects, part of what we want to do here is to educate and empower and co-power the community so that it really isn't a function of just whether SGA is around as to whether the community gets some of the things it seeks. So as advocates, we want to build in the community the understanding and the tools to actually become citizen advocates, become part of the implementation themselves, and not just, well, as long as SGA is around and there's an analysis that they can, that SGA will get it done. Part of what we're trying to do is really think about how the community will know enough and then follow through, because as Chris said, you're never really done. The other thing I'll say is, we're a little bit, we are part and parcel of a contract with our clients. So, it sort of depends on the contract and the phasing and the timing. One of the challenges always is, when do things actually happen? And so, there's a number of processes that are happening right as we speak. And it also depends on what happens in the market. So, we're going to be partnering with the community, with HES and the like, to not only do the analysis and share our thoughts, but also to build in them the ability to help implement themselves. So it's not just a function of whether we're here or not.
Great, thank you very much.
I'm gonna ask Chris or Beth. I know I could talk about some of the work we've done in local governments with codes and getting a community right to the point where the planning staff in this case would take it over, bring a revised code to the planning board and the city council and carry it through. But Beth and Chris have done a lot of other kinds of technical assistance, and it's an art knowing at what point, how to set a community up so that they're ready to move forward on their own. And I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have one example of, because we can't be there forever, but we also don't want to do all this work and see nothing happen. So it's an art to get a community right to the point where, it's like, where they're ready to take off on their own. So Chris or Beth, do you have a good example? How do we know and how does that done?
I'll have Chris come up with his favorite specific example, but I will say that we were the technical assistance providers for the Federal Transit Administration for a few years, where we provided equitable transit-oriented development help to communities that were building transit systems with the FTA's New Starts program or Small Starts program. And it was our job to go in and help them figure out not just how to preserve affordability for people who were going to be most transit dependent, but also to figure out what affordability in that region meant and what level of affordable housing they even had available in the corridor to meet the demand. And I can tell you some of the ones I worked on that I really liked, but Chris, I know you worked on more than I did. And if there's one that sticks out that you want to highlight.
Well, I must hesitate to, take the trouble. The specific example is it won't fit your situation, right? It'll be like, well, that's great, but it doesn't fit here because of this. And that's like kind of always the case. And the things you need to do to make, to make this last and, have staying power and work when we go away depend a lot on, because ultimately it's really up to what happens in the community. It depends a lot on what happens during the process that can be built that remains. And those, to a large degree, come down to relationships. I mean, part of what I think makes the biggest difference is when you're starting in a project and, you have an issue for a community and there's opportunity, but there's a lot of concern, and there's concern for all kinds of reasons, and people they don't start out feeling like they're on the same side of something. The most successful ones are where at the end, there's a consensus around a set of things we're going to do to ensure this. And there are institutions created, or, existing institutions are used in a way that bring people together regularly to ensure that we stay on the path we all agreed to. That to me is the most successful ones. And, I keep talking about this one from when I was in office because it's one with the longest track. I mean, a lot of things we do, I did stuff last year or the year before that I think is going to be great, but you won't really know for a few years, right? So, in terms of the ones that seem to have lasted where we're seeing results, the example in the one in my community that I cited was basically we learned real quick that it wasn't just done. And so we had to kind of institutionalize the process of community representatives staying together, working together, and having regular liaison with the people who make the decisions in the county. And so we were able to get that to where instead of being adversarial, it's a regular dialogue. And you have a plan that says, yeah, we said we're going to do these things. And as you move along, people are able to say, what's happening on this one? And developing the tools that you're going to need, because whatever you adopted last year is great, but there's going to be something that comes up in 3 years and 4 years. You don't know about that, right? And you need the mechanism that allows you to address that and to not make it every time something comes up or you're moving along and you run into challenges that, you reopen the same old fight. You need to have the continuing sense that we have the same mission, that we're on the same course, and we got to work out this problem. And so I think a lot of the most successful ones are setting up those mechanisms that give confidence, and where the community feels like they know where to go, they know what to do, and there's that network working for it, so that you have information flowing in both directions. And almost all the ones that are really successful at last for a time, I think, have that in common. They may do different things. One may have a place-based organization. I can give you examples of that. Some may be based on specific, plan amendments and things like that. But really what it comes down to is that it's a continuing dialogue and that trust is built up on both sides over time.
Are there any other council members that have a question for SGA? I don't see. Okay. What about the planning board? Are any members of the planning board? Okay, I guess not.
I think
Mayor Kim Salerno has her hand raised.
I'm sorry, what, Chris?
Kim Salerno has her hand raised.
Okay, thank you. Kim?
Yeah, I thought we used the hand raise function, so I used
Yeah,
that.
I'm not, I don't have all the pictures here.
Okay, thanks. So the first question is, since the residents are the client, how will your plan interface with the existing regulatory documents, and where will it sit? Like, where will it actually be, and who will maintain it, and who will have access to it, and how will it get referenced? And then the second question is, for a city the size, the scale, and age of Newport, what factors aggravate inequity most?
I guess the answer to the first question is that what we're working on is, as we said earlier, a toolbox that really the community and the city ideally would use together. It's not a document necessarily like a comp plan or even the urban plan or zoning amendments. It would be a series of programs or policies or goals that either the community, either the residents or the city or together they would agree on and move forward. I mean, it will be written down, but it's not a single document that's a legal document that has to be filed in a certain or maintained in a certain way. What we've talked to the residents about at this point and what we've seen in other communities is that an organization that represents the community becomes the shepherd or the keeper of that plan and tracking the metrics that I described earlier. And that frequently happens. Generically, it's called a place management organization. And I know that's something that some of the residents are interested in learning more about and seeing if it applies here. If there is an agreement, for example, between the developer and the community, or the developer and the city and the community, Chris mentioned a community benefits agreement, that would be obviously a legal document that would be maintained with a development agreement. So it varies as to what the documentation and the maintenance would be. And then I think your other question was really about the historic nature of Newport. Is that right?
No, I'm saying that with your experience in comparable cities, what factors aggravate inequity most?
You know, I mean, I think it's really, I mean, part of your situation is that you have because you're an island and you're land constrained, and because you have a history of being a highly attractive, desirable place, that it's difficult to maintain a diversity of incomes and diversity of community, because the natural tendency is for property values to go up. I know you've had an influx of a lot of people over the last year, mostly people who are high wage earners, and that puts pressure on your very limited amount of land. And so you have to decide whether you're committed to maintaining that diversity. And if you are, then finding tools and ways to do that. Chris, I don't know, do you have other thoughts?
Yeah, but Calvin, after Calvin.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, Calvin, I didn't see you.
Oh, no worries. I'll say, maybe this would be, try to say things that are easy to remember. I will say my answer to you are 3 I's, the letter I. The first is a lack of information. The second would be a lack of intentionality. And a third would be a poor implementation. So the first would be information, and Marta talked about this, which is oftentimes communities don't actually know. When we talk about, Christian was mentioning displacement risk. Well, who are the residents that are actually at risk to be displaced based on the market conditions and the development that's coming? Oftentimes, we're fighting about equitable development and trying to benefit the community, but we don't have the underlying data and analysis to say, who's really at risk right now? Where are those people living? Is it the people that are right adjacent to a particular development that's happening? Is it because of certain zoning changes, which will immediately create risk to certain folks? And, digging down a little further, what type of people are at risk? So you might have a community that the biggest risks of displacement are to renters. You might have another section of the community that the biggest risk of displacement are to long-term owners who are seniors who own their own homes, but because property taxes may rise, values may rise, maintenance issues, so that information about who's at risk is critical. And often when folks don't have that, they're just sort of advocating for equity without detail. Intentionality, the second, is frankly what we're working on and what you guys have already done in many ways, which is already naming that equity is a goal and that you want the information you need and a strategy to kind of get there. And then third and finally is this implementation question, which is why we talk about community benefits agreements, place management, and all the array, as Chris said, of options. Because a lot of those options really get to, oh, you got the great idea, you have the information, but who's actually going to do it? Who's going to follow through? So I would say those are the three things, and hopefully we'll present a strategy to try to get to those three things.
Hey, I believe we have one other question from planning. Mr. Oliveira? Thank you.
Hi, thank you, everyone. My first question is just really for Christian. I believe he started to mention it before, and I think I missed it. Why are we so late into the game? Because we've spent months and months about talking about this through planning board, through meetings, through the public and everything else. And now this is sort of a stop to what we're trying to move forward with, at least from my perspective. I might have missed it, but I just wondered what the reason was.
I'm so glad you asked, because I realized like 20 minutes ago that I just forgot to get to that point when I was doing my introduction. So, and the why now is probably the easiest thing, which is you can't react to something until it exists. And so, yes, there was a master plan. And yes, there was community participation and engagement. But until the North End Urban Plan is proposed, and until you see what's being proposed, the community cannot react to it. And so that's what happened, is it became clear that just as is happening across the nation, areas that have been historic, that have experienced historic disinvestment, planners are brought in and they apply best planning practices to increase density, to create a mix of uses, a street network, multimodal transportation, form-based code, all of these things that are great and will improve how a place looks and functions. This is what's being proposed. The problem is not with what is included in the plan. The problem is what isn't included, which are these strategies and policies to prevent displacement, right? It gets to, we want that economic investment. We want there to be gentrification without displacement. And so the why now is because we didn't know that that's what was being proposed until the plan was done. And we recognized that's what was being proposed.
And my other question was really for staff. I didn't know, I thought there was a hard date for the moratorium. And if there is a hard date, would we be able to get this additional plan incorporated prior to that? Because I believe there was a 1 year or a year and a half approximation for this to happen. I didn't know if we could condense that before the city council had an opportunity to lift it.
Jeff, I believe the moratorium is up now. However, perhaps our attorney, Chris Bean.
Yeah, there's no moratorium in effect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John. Jeff, I'm sorry, John, have you asked all your questions, John?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Jeff Brooks, I believe you have some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Politano. Thanks everyone for attending. So honestly, I'm just confused. I guess I just don't get it. Like we've been working on between workshops, like basically just to go back on what John was going on for maybe 20 something months. And we have a plan that the planning board had several special meetings to go over, discuss and amendments, this and that and this, and to draft our, to approve the North End plan. And now we're doing this, which, okay, fine. You want to be reactionary to it. Okay, fine. But like, where does it stand on this actually, like the plan actually coming together. Like if the bridge realignment is supposed to be taking place in the next 12 months, and the planning board was intending on writing the actual zoning code to reflect the actual plan that was put together over the next 6 months, because we were hoping to actually have basically this thing hitting the ground. Let's do it and implement it this year by the end of the summer. Like, are you guys gonna be working in concert with us? I'm just confused. So now is the whole thing starting over? Is that what you're doing?
Jeff, I want to clarify this for a moment. I was asked by a council member to allow them to make a presentation to the council. They are employed by HES, the Health Equity Zone. This is just the type of work they do just to give us an understanding. But this does not change, in my mind, all the work that has been done, all the meetings that have occurred. You may look at it as an extra layer, but the layer is really on the HES. It's not on the city, and it's not on the planning at this point. It is, I guess it has gotten very confusing. I thought this was just a presentation as to the work that you would be doing for HES. If I'm off base with this, I'd like somebody to speak up at this point. Melissa, Melissa?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I don't have an answer to your question, but I do feel like I've interpreted the presentation this evening differently. I too had concerns that my concern was mainly that this would be a duplicative process to the North End Urban Plan. And what I'm learning here tonight is that this is actually an opportunity from my perspective to take our plans and continue them as living, breathing documents into another phase. And in fact, I really get the impression that we're going to learn some strategies to bring them to life. And bring them to life better than we've already done them, which is really, I think our collective goal is, we do things, we do them well, and we keep them going better. So the only other thing I want to add is for Christian and the Smart Growth team, we also, in addition to all these things going on, we also have a transportation master plan that we'll be embarking on shortly. So I'd love for you guys to keep that in the back of your minds as you go along through this process. So I'm excited. I'm grateful for the information, and I have a different clarity on it. Thank you.
Okay, and Councilor McCalla, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to echo the same sentiments as Melissa, in which this is an opportunity for us to do a process and do our process in a way that we can shift and shape into something that, if anything, it warrants a better way of doing things. And I totally understand how some of us could be overwhelmed with all of the information. This was a lot of information to process, and perhaps, and maybe thank God for Zoom, because you may need to watch this a few times, because this is huge. This is changing the way that we're thinking about things. We're being intentional by not creating harm. We are addressing the hunger, and as Beth Osborne had put it, the hunger for a livable community that we all share, and that I think that we can all agree to the fact that we want to do something that's going to enhance and be for the betterment of our community. And to everyone else, I'd say, what's wrong with that?
Okay, thank you. I just want to point out that this is not a city initiative. This is an initiative embraced by HES, and they wanted to present some of the things that they felt in the future could help, but also to perhaps touch on displacement. And that's the only question I have in terms of displacement. How does a city go about putting in any kind of program with private entities? I mean, we don't control, one of the displacement areas is a complex over in the North End that is not regulated by the government, that is privately owned. And there was a question there. So I'm just wondering, is there some sort of animal that is out there that is utilized? I don't know. Yes, Chris, if somebody has an answer, please raise your hand.
I mean, I can tell you that is the big question. That certainly was, you know, in my own community, when I was in your position. You know, similarly, most of what we had is basically all privately controlled. I mean, there's hardly any publicly controlled land at all, and most of the housing we had, you know, a significant threat to housing affordability in a community with thousands of units. I mean, ultimately, we had, you know, we counted basically 6,200 units at risk that were market rate units. These are privately owned. They're not, you know, they're not under the government's control or anything like that. And, you know, if the values rise, you know, we could already see it happening where, you know, it's the natural course of things for people who own property. They could, you know, they can simply, you know, fix up the places and, you know, put in marble and brass fixtures and charge twice as much rent. Well, you know, they're going to do that. So, you know, how do you deal with that? That you're not going to control this property. So what you have to do is, that's why I said we need a whole bunch of tools. You have to have a whole set of policies and programs that allow you to incentivize the behavior you want. So, you know, we used everything from, you know, the tools we have used before, like low income tax credit, you know, and we had a whole program for helping, you know, create more affordable housing. But we combine that with other things like a form-based code, and where we made it desirable. You can take advantage of the form-based code and you can create something that's going to be really valuable for you, but we also have to preserve the housing. And with a whole set of different tools that provide different kinds of incentives, we were able to, you know, come up with something that when we run the numbers, you know, correspond to the a number of units we knew we'd need to either protect or create, you know, to compensate for any loss, so that we could have, you know, again, the target of anybody who lives here now could live here in the future. It won't necessarily be the same people, but, you know, all the families that are here now would have a place in the future. And that's, you know, with, as I said, a range of different tools worked into, you know, the plan that, you know, includes all the, you know, the built environment stuff that you're normally working on with in a comprehensive plan.
Okay, thank you. We only have a few minutes left. Maybe we should allocate this for the public, if you don't
ask a question.
Okay, Counselor.
Okay, Chris, where did you live?
I did and still do live in the community of Arlington, Virginia, which is in Northern Virginia near Washington, D.C. It's a community of about 200,000 people.
And just a quick question. You talk about tools. Are you talking about anything like rent control?
That is not something you can do in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So that was one of the things on the list we could quickly eliminate. Was not an option for us.
All right. Well, one of the things I want to say is I agree with the mayor. This was our understanding that this was a presentation, and we understand that. And I think that, and I'm only going to speak for myself, I think that if there's an idea that the city is going to, in my opinion, stop what we've been doing for all this time with the planning board to allow this to go somewhere else. I can tell you that I can't do that myself. I can't support stopping what we've done. And there's a time element here. And I also think that because VSA doesn't work for the city, was not hired by the city, that in fact, you know, if we were going to hire a group, we would have gone through a process. So I just want to put it perfectly out there, and I always tell it like it is.
Okay, thank you. At this point, we really have exceeded our time. I'd like perhaps some closing remarks from Kristen, and maybe the heads could actually sponsor another presentation that would allow the public to really ask the questions. Chris.
Madam Chair, I'm just wondering if there was a reason why we couldn't go a little bit longer.
Yeah.
Well, only to 6:45, okay?
And it is my understanding, Madam Chair, that this is the proper venue to be able to incite community engagement as well, and that the public will be allowed to be able to comment.
Fine. Well, then we'll have the public ask the questions now. If the panelists want to put their hands down, we can get to the public's questions, okay? That would be fine. All right, let's see. Jen and Mitchell, they have their hands, okay.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you? Let me see. I don't know how to get the camera to come up, but my question is this. I've been process. My name is Jennifer Jackson, sorry. I live at 38 Dudley Ave on the north end of town. I was on the process of the housing group, and I was on the process of getting Growth Smart there. My question is this: if Growth Smart does come up with a development plan, how are we assured as residents that our voice will truly be heard and whatever is in the development plan is honored? Or is there a process where as though we could come up with a development plan and the city can say, oh, we don't like this, and then it's time and resources that have gone to waste again? And I have a question, like, how do we make sure that the development plan will be honored when Smart Growth does all this hard work of talking to the North End residents? Because you guys did your work, but a lot of it wasn't just North End residents' voices that were being heard. It was more other parts of town, which is fine. But, you know, we're concerned about the immediate impact of this development on our community. And that's why we gathered together as residents to try to find a way to get somebody in that will be our voice. So again, if we come up with a development plan, will it be honored by the city?
First of all, I think the questions need to be directed toward the presenters for the SGA, Smart Growth. It's not for the council at this point to answer the questions.
Well, can Smart Growth say to me as a resident, explain to me if the city has to honor their work? Then I will word it like that for you.
Let's see. I can't see my
Marta.
Yeah, I can see my mute button. Okay, there. I cannot assure you it is not our role to predict or what the city council or the planning board will do. Our goal is to work with both the residents and the city staff and be transparent and open in our discussions so that as this development strategy is developed, that there's no surprises and that it's something that the city thinks is feasible and actually positive, a contribution to the implementation strategy. It's not a plan to conflict with the urban plan or the comp plan. It is a set of tools that will enable the implementation of that plan in a way that will benefit the residents as well as the city overall.
Thank you, Marta. I believe we have a question from Melanie O'Brien. And it has to be a question that's posed to the Smart Growth America team.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. My name is Melody O'Brien. I am a resident of the North End. I am also the co-operator and chair of a not-for-profit organization that helps the houseless in Newport. My question is a statement followed up with a question. First, we have had city council members that have sat on the council and stated how a lot of the low income residents in the North End are a burden to the city, and that they want our neighboring towns, Portsmouth and Middletown, to pick up the burden because Newport holds a lion's share of the burden, because at that time there was 17% of low income here when the state mandate is 10%. Now my question is, how does GSA go into a city or a town or whatever, knowing that the sitting council, that there are members of the sitting council who already have that kind of attitude towards the low income people here? And if that is already the attitude towards the council, how are we safe from not being gentrified out of here and pushed out? Thank you.
I'm going to defer to Calvin to try and address that.
One of the terms we used very early on here in terms of thinking about how we think about these type of projects is a people-based strategy. And so, I applaud you both for the work you do on a day-to-day basis. And what we're going to try to do through talking to folks and hearing the concerns and the issues and the challenges, as well as taking our experience, what we're hoping to do is to have a strategy that lifts up those people-based challenges and then also lifts up the types of things we've seen be successful in other places as a possible way to prevent some of the very issues that you described. So the point of the strategy is to say, let's understand who are the people that are at risk here based on what may happen next. And those include people who are not housed, as you said. And we will think about then, what are the strategies we've seen and maybe we've heard, we get input locally that can help that not come to pass. So that's the way we think about it.
Thank you. We have another caller, Phyllis Mulligan.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good.
My name is Phyllis Mulligan, and I live at 200 Park Home in Newport, Rhode Island. And my question is similar to the one that the previous lady just said. Can GrowSmart help bridge the gap between the city council and the residents to achieve the goals and the needs of the residents?
I'll just jump in and then we can all answer. One of the reasons, and we started with discussing our background. And one of the reasons, and Chris Zimmerman, former elected official, myself, I didn't talk about my background, but I've worked for affordable housing developer for many years. I've also worked in city government as city staff. and others have worked in parts of the private sector. Beth talked about her government experience. Is one of the things we bring to the table on behalf of the community is that we're not just advocates who only understand equity and how to get things done just from the community perspective. We've sat in the seat of elected officials, as public sector government professionals, as private sector developers trying to get things done. And so to answer your question, what we will bring to the table is an understanding how all of the players at the table will be thinking about these issues. And we will do our best to craft a strategy that doesn't just say, well, here's what the community said, so that's the answer. We're going to say, let's take into account what the community said. Let's hear what private sector folks might be thinking. Let's hear what the elected officials are thinking. Let's hear what public sector folks, city planning board members, city staff are thinking, and take all of that information and our experience sitting in those seats and say, what's a strategy that's feasible and viable that can get us the equitable outcome? So that is, I think, something we uniquely bring to the table, the bridge, the various perspectives, because we've sat in those seats.
Okay, thank you. Donna McCarthy? Donna?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Hi, Donna McCarthy. I live on William Street, Newport. I'm just a little worried about hearing the reactions of the city and the planning group to the presentation. I'm just worried that we're not in sync right now. And I'm wondering, the question is, the time frame that the consultants have come up with looks like you end sometime around 2022. But is it based on the amount of work you have to do, or have you made an attempt to integrate this plan with the other plans that are going on in the city so that everything is synced up and we don't have two ships passing in the night on this? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. It's the amount of time that we anticipate the project taking is a combination of the work that needs to be done and the pace at which community engagement can occur. It's easy or takes less time perhaps than to sit down and write a plan or write a strategy, but to actually work with a group of community members around their priorities and to vet those with the city and to have the kind of dialogue that's going to produce feasible, viable options takes time. And it's as much about the actual amount of work and analysis as it is just the amount of engagement. I recognize that you have zoning codes that are pending. You've adopted an urban plan. The city has, and the community was successfully able to have amendments included in that plan, which touch on some of these equity objectives. Our goal is to work with the community and the city to develop some very concrete tools and implementation strategies that are going to make those provisions a reality. Some of them are in zoning, but a lot of them have to do with other programs that'll take time to evolve. And I recognize that there's been a lot of work that's already been done, and that there are some upcoming plans and zoning amendments that are pending, and that there's action that's going to be taken in the short term. But there are also many things that can be developed over time and implemented. And there's nothing that can't be updated or changed as this equity strategy evolves.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. I don't know. Okay, Gabby, I know you've been on. I see your hand raised. Gabby, if you're on the phone, unmute yourself.
Sorry, take some time to rejoin. So my question is based on what was just said by Marta. So do you believe that the council's concerns of time constraints are reasonable compared to like the time that it would take to deeply consider equity with community planning?
I'm not sure I have a complete understanding of their concerns about time constraints. What I heard, I think, was a concern that we were redoing or proposing to redo work that's already been done. And I hope we've communicated that, at least my understanding is that it's not our intention, and it's not the community's intention to have us redo work that's already been done. You've done a lot of work. We respect that work. We appreciate it. I think what we're really working on is part of an implementation strategy to carry those plans forward. So I don't hear a conflict in terms of time constraints. I hear more that there's been a lot of work done, and do we understand and respect that work, and is it our intention to develop an alternative or to build on that work? And I think we've tried to say that it's our intention to build on that work and carry it forward with some recommended strategies on how you implement the work you've done.
Thank you, Marta. That concludes tonight's meeting. I'd like to thank Christian Belden, also the representatives from HES and the Smart Growth of America, and your representatives, Calvin, Chris, Marta, and I know Elizabeth, I think, is the other person. And I do think this conversation can continue in the community. I know that this was a lot of information for people to kind of absorb at one time, but I would like to say that at this point, the group working is the HES with Smart Growth of America. The city has done a lot of work, and certainly I anticipate at some point they'll be asking for different information or different questions. However, it is the HES that is spearheading this conversation. But I thank you very much for coming forward, and I love DC. I was born and raised there, so I know exactly the different areas that you were talking about. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor. And I want to thank the council and the planning board for inviting us and listening. And I know it's a lot, so we're happy to answer questions through your staff or whatever works best. So thanks a lot, and thanks for having us.
Thank you, Mom.
Thank you.
And thanks the public and the planning board for coming too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.